Welcome to the Dare to Know podcast. I'm your host, Fabian Corver. Today, we are joined by Andrea Borghini. Andrea Borghini is the Associate Professor of Philosophy at the University of Milan and Director of Culinary Mind, an international research center for the philosophy of food. In his work, he develops new theoretical tools to rethink how we speak, structure, sense, and feel about food, eating, and culinary culture. Professor Borghini's specific topics of research include hunger and appetite, recipes, food and space, and biodiversity. His research sits at the intersection of theory, value, and practice. He's the co-editor of A Philosophy of Recipes, Making, Experiencing, Valuing, and author of A Critical Introduction to the Metaphysics of Modality, and co-author of Brill's Companion to the Philosophy of Biology, Entities, Processes, Implications. You can find all the relevant links to Professor Borghini's books in the description of this video. I hope you enjoyed this episode. The Dare to Know podcast is now also available on iTunes and Spotify. Please check out the links in the description below. Professor Borghini, welcome to the Dare to Know podcast.
Thank you for having me.
Yes, great to have you here. So really looking forward to this discussion. So maybe before we sort of dive straight into the questions, could you just tell my audience a little bit more about your background? How did you get interested in philosophy? And then also ultimately ended up in sort of the philosophy of food?
Okay, yeah. To cut a long story short, I grew up in Italy, as probably my accent reveals, and we do philosophy also in high school here. And so when I was 16, I read Plato's Republic, and that really got me into philosophy. And from then, I started reading more and more philosophers. I did undergraduate in Italy, where my background was especially philosophy of science and logic. And then I did a PhD in the United States at Columbia University, where I studied primarily analytic metaphysics and philosophy of biology. And while I was doing my PhD, I started realizing that there were a number of questions that could have been related to analytic metaphysics and philosophy of biology, but actually were emerging from my daily culinary experiences. So just even going to a supermarket and buying a simple yogurt, and figuring how the label for the yogurt was fabricated, even just how the name yogurt was constructed. And so I started thinking that should have been the subject of some more serious research on part of philosophers too, that the philosophers should have joined that were thinking about food items. And so when I started teaching after my graduate school, I had the opportunity to start develop a course that was interdisciplinary, in a sense. It was about philosophy and food, and that was 2008. And so I started teaching courses on philosophy of food since 2008, and I never stopped because I really got into the topic. So the angle that I work on in philosophy of food is especially an angle that is, as you could say, theoretical, and it comes from metaphysics, philosophy of science, and that tries to see the connection between theoretical issues and more ethical, political, cultural ones.
No, that's really fascinating. And maybe you could also, introduce, the sort of the research center that you started, like the Culinary Mind. What is that research center, and sort of how is that, related to this topic of the philosophy of food?
Yeah. So it's a center that was established in 2018. Together with a colleague that works in Fribourg. He's a young scholar, Patrick Engish, and so his Culinary Mind is the name. And we wanted basically to bring together different scholars that work on food from a philosophical angle. As you might have seen yourself, when you try to do research on philosophy and food, it's not even easy or simple to figure out what are the different research areas right now and how are they connected, if they are connected. It still often happens to talk to a philosopher, to a colleague that works on food politics that has never heard of some other colleague that works in a different area, say epistemology, but actually with a strong overlap, because there's no central place where these people could meet. So what we thought of doing was precisely to try and bring people together, connect people, having conferences, podcasts, seminars, and that's what we organize. So we we try to organize events that advance the conversation among philosophers, and not only philosophers, on issues, mostly conceptual issues that pertain to food. The angle that we gave to the center is specifically perhaps more theoretical, in the sense that we thought that there was a particular lack in an analysis of fundamental conceptual issues that could be put together with the really good work that has already been done and had already been done on the aesthetics of food, or some of food ethics, such vegetarianism, and some of issues on food politics. We are really a young center, having been there for only 3 years, but we are organizing still a lot of events, and we hope to continue in the coming years.
No, it's really fascinating, and it's definitely the only research center on the philosophy of food that I could find. So that's very impressive work. And then sort of maybe before diving into sort of the subject matter of the philosophy of food, before we start thinking about this topic, what are some of sort of the methodological questions that we should be thinking about before sort of entering this field? Maybe disciplinaries working together, or what are the questions that we should be thinking about?
No, I think this is an especially important question that on which there isn't yet enough maybe shared conversation, because as you yourself might have seen, and in recording this series on podcast on philosophy of food, you find scholars that have quite different backgrounds, and that might also use different types of sources. And yet, I think to work on philosophy of food is almost unavoidably interdisciplinary, in the sense that it requires some type of understanding about the food world, and in some cases requires a very close dialogue with scholars that come from other fields. It could be cognitive science, economics, sociology, or what is needed is it's a reflection on how to work on the specific branch of philosophy. In my own terms, I've reflected quite a bit on the problem, and the angle that I take is specifically looking at key concepts in the concern food, such as hunger, recipe, it could be ingredient, it could be local, the idea of locality, and thinking how we can or we should revise, reformulate such concepts so that they serve a better function, if any, in contemporary societies. And so this is, for me, this is one way in which philosophers can contribute, but it's by no means, I think, the only way in which philosophers do contribute or can contribute, but is certainly a specific methodology that I'm trying to develop, and I've developed in the past few years.
And is there also a difference in your view, sort of entering the field of the philosophy of food, when we think about like the Analytic tradition or the Continental tradition, like, are these different ways of approaching this topic, or do you think they very much work closely together, when we look specifically at the philosophy of food, or are they different ways of introducing the topic?
If you ask to myself, I would say no. Probably if you ask the same question to other philosophers, I think they would say yes. Clearly, however, it's true that each of us brings its own, also training and skills and capacities, background. So the methodology that I just suggested to you, based on conceptual, it's not exactly an analysis. Some people today like to use the term conceptual engineering. I don't think I'm doing only that. It's not just a re-engineering of a concept, but is thinking of concept with the help of other scholars is certainly something that might pertain more to an analytic philosopher, somewhat like myself. But I think also I could see a number of philosophers that they'll probably place themselves within a continental tradition or certain northern analytic tradition that would do quite similar work. So including philosophers that work on history of ideas, and that maybe are political philosophers that don't recognize themselves necessarily with either the analytic or the continental tradition. So probably that question depends on who you ask. For me, no, I don't think that it just depends on this division.
That's helpful. And then, when we take the philosophy of food, one specific focus or something you've written a lot about is sort of the philosophy of recipes. Could you maybe introduce sort of the philosophy of recipes? What sort of questions are we thinking about, and why has that been, a main focus of yours when thinking about the philosophy of food?
Yeah, so when I started teaching courses on food and thinking about the main questions that were not addressed by philosophers, and there were many, I wanted to start from a food item that was really prominent and central. And so I started thinking and looking a bit into the literature on recipes, and it was surprising to notice that even though recipe books have basically the market for recipe book has exploded in the past few decades. Right now we have hundreds of thousands of recipe books, even just in English, about all sorts of issues, or from the past, from the future, and so on and so forth. Actually, if you were looking for it's not even a definition of a recipe, but some account of what a recipe is, you couldn't find any. There was, pretty much no account of what a recipe was. What could be a good theory of recipe? There are very nice volumes about maybe the historical conceptions of recipe, the history of recipes, and recipe and identity, but nothing, like an account. So I thought that was a really good starting point, because recipes sit at the center between, ingredients and the actual meal. They are relatively abstract entities, and they can be considered parallel to some other artifacts, such as maybe songs or some form of instructions, procedures that philosophers have dealt with. They wondered, what exactly is a proof, what is a procedure, what is but they hadn't wondered about what is a recipe. So I thought that it could have been an interesting, comparison to make, and certainly I was going to deal with the central item. So recipes today in our culture, they play a crucial function in a lot of different areas, from cultural heritage to basically basic functions, like when you go to a restaurant you have to order, to when you have to tell maybe someone what kind of diet to follow. It's very easy to tell it through recipes, or if you have to inform students about what kind of food they're going to eat next week at school, in the cafeteria, you give them some recipes. And at the same time, of course, if we don't have a good definition, this leaves open the door for all sorts of issues that could come up, and this is in fact what happens.
And so you sort of set out like 4 theoretical frameworks to think about the question, like, what is a recipe? So maybe could you just introduce some of these accounts, and then also maybe which account of what is a recipe sort of suits your preference, and why, of course.
Yeah, no, I mean, in part there was it draws on a relatively old paper, it's 5-6 years old, where I tried to figure out what could be different theoretical frameworks we could have for recipes, right? And one very intuitive framework is to think of recipes as procedures that just describe what a process is, and so you could think of that in terms of a realist account of recipes, where you have to, if I tell you what is how to make a hamburger, it's very clear that you have to take some bread and you have to take some something that is a patty that could be made of meat or something, some other substance of that, and lettuce, and then you have to make it into a sandwich. And that procedure, one could think, is can be described in terms that leave out no room to equivocation to some extent, right? So that and so that understanding of a recipe is very close to the medical use of the term. Recipe. The idea of recipes really evolved also alongside the history of medicine and the history of also chemistry, say in textile, or where you had to create colors, dyes for coloring fabrics, and or in medicine and clearly in medicine you don't want to leave too much room for ambiguities. So you want to have a conception of the recipe for an aspirin has to be, very precise. But even then, I think you actually leave room to ambiguity. So the idea of a realist conception is it's intuitively very strong in the mind of many of us in some contexts. But it's clearly problematic because we encounter a number of occasions where, especially with the food, because the food evolves, we don't know, we confront a dilemma with respect to the identity of a recipe. I'll give you just a couple of really basic examples. So think of, I mentioned the hamburger, nobody thought when they were talking about hamburger of whether lab meat, so-called lab meat, should have been something that could have become the ingredient of the patty, in the burger, And so is that still an hamburger if it's made with that kind of meat, or is it a different kind of entity? What if you instead use the ingredients of the impossible burger? Is it still a burger or not? So these possibilities were just not there 10, 20 years ago. People couldn't even perhaps imagine of them. And so once we face these possibilities, we have to think whether to include those items or not under the concept of hamburger. Another recent example that stirred up some controversies in Rome is about a machine that makes pizza. And so you can order a pizza margherita that is made by a machine. There is no pizza maker, that is making it. And so people were really protesting. It was covered recently on the New York Times because some residents of Rome, they were protesting that was not pizza. You couldn't call it pizza. And then, of course, the people that came up with the idea of the machine, they were claiming, yes, perfectly, it follows the procedure of a pizza. You just take some dough, you cook it, and so on and so forth. And so that's a pizza. And so you can think who can decide whether that's a pizza or not. We simply don't have an answer right then unless we have a good theory of a recipe, right? And in some cases, so if you think that there is a realist answer, you think that there is only one way of solving this question. But clearly, I think these examples show that we have to make a choice about what is it that we want to call pizza, or what is it that we want to call burger. When is it that a certain item deserves to be called a pizza or a burger, right? And there are plenty of other cases, virtually any kind of entity that we eat, including yogurt, we have debated whether it deserves to be called yogurt or not, and so once you face these type of issues, you realize that perhaps it's best not to use the term, not to use the realist position, but to use a position that is, I call it in the paper, constructivist of some sort, where the idea of a burger, the idea of a pizza, like a pizza margherita, is the outcome of a social negotiation, and this is precisely what fits together with what I was telling you before. We have a concept, like the concept of pizza margherita or the concept of a burger, and we have to negotiate its identity through some kind of process. And I think philosophers can figure out what sorts of negotiations can be, how these negotiations can happen, like under which conditions you should call it a pizza or not, and whether the criteria that we're using stay, are similar, analogous or not across the spectrum of the food items. Because you understand, negotiating the identity of pizza is quite different than negotiating the identity of vegan milk. But vegan milk, for example, was quite recently discussed by the EU, is the amendment 171 that was discussed in the EU Parliament recently, where we had to understand under which conditions we could call a certain package of milk, whether it was vegan or not, milk. And that's really about fixing the identity of the concept and how the concept is used. So I think what I was arguing for example, in the paper, what I've argued for is that some sort of constructivist view that emphasizes the fact that we have to have a process of negotiation is crucial for recipes. But then in the paper, I also mentioned that there are two other important probably moments, ways in which theoretical frameworks we can use for understanding recipes. One is what I call the existentialist framework that is used in the literature on tourism. So imagine you're a tourist, you are just strolling, I don't know, precisely in Rome, and you want to have a pizza, and you end up, you think, okay, there is this machine that gives us Italian pizza, why not? So we try it, and for you, that's perfectly, that's perfectly all right to call it pizza if the people there, they have named it pizza. After all, you are in Rome, they call it pizza, so you can accept it. And this view is the one that I call a naive view of recipes, meaning that you go by the custom or whatever people call it, right? So you go to a place, they tell you that dish is called so and so, and you accept it because you have a naive attitude. The naive here is, I don't intend it as a value judgment. It's the fact that you like to stay on the surface because perhaps you don't consider yourself an insider, or you are not in a moment, in a situation, in a context where you really are trying to go more down the surface. And then there is what I call the existentialist conception. That is instead something that relates to something that could be considered precisely personal or related to maybe your own identity or sense of identity. So think of someone that lives in a legal setting where almond milk is not, you can't call it milk, but actually you grew up in a family where your parents, grandparents, great-grandparents constantly drink almond milk and call it milk. And so you may want to, at home, when you're having it, you may want to refer to it by using the term almond milk to the recipe, even though legally you are in a context where you can't use it, right? So there are situations where the best theoretical framework is not one that is legal, is not one that is negotiated, but it could be something that is tied to personal memories or histories. And I think these uses of these theoretical frameworks can also be really important. For example, if you're assessing the ways in which people go about thinking of their own diet, or thinking of in what ways their own diet fits a certain cultural context, and whether they belong to that context, or how they reinvent their identity in a specific context. In those cases, I think it's best to leave out of the picture maybe a strictly or more strongly constructivist framework, and to use more an existential framework. So I hope this clarifies a little bit some of the issues. But as you were saying at the beginning, there was no theoretical framework in general for recipes. So this is what philosophers can do, is to think precisely of a concept of a food item like that, and think of how to develop a theory of it that then can have legal uses, or uses in precisely in public health, in communication of public health, about dieting, and or for analyzing cultural heritage, food cultures in general.
No, I think this is very helpful, and it immediately sort of shows like what's at stake, I guess, because on the one hand, like the existential sort of theoretical framework seems to like emphasize, or at least maybe privilege, like sort of the individualistic sort of stance, while the constructivist maybe emphasizes on the collective, and then it's like, how do we negotiate that? And it seems to also say that you don't necessarily think that we could be pluralistic about these frameworks and say, okay, which frameworks make sense in which context? Is that sort of reasonable?
Yeah. No, it's because in the end, we're dealing here with what has been called, can be called innocent pluralism.
Yes.
These theoretical frameworks take over different explanatory purposes, and so there is not so much theoretical conflict you could think between. These are really different conceptions of reality. It's almost like they're different concepts that we're using. The existential one and the constructivist ones are different. I think where there is a lot of tension is usually between the realist conception and the constructivist conception, in a number of cases. And in the other situations, there might be less tension, but you could see that there are different frameworks at play. And I think it's important to recognize that, to properly assess and explain what it is, the ways in which we speak about food. We talk about food.
And in one of your other articles, you sort of raise 7 philosophical questions about recipes, one of which sort of focuses on the question, how do recipes come to be, cease to exist, and what keeps them into existence? So how should we start thinking about the question of existence with regards to recipes?
Yeah, and here, a lot also trades off on how we, if we think of recipes in terms of something that is more concrete, including, so for example, the ceremonials that comes with them, right? So it's not just the procedure of making a pizza margherita, but it's also the fact that maybe you have a pizza maker and you can ask about how to make it, and you can ask for modifications in ways that are extemporaneous, and so on and so forth, and also the conditions under which you eat it. Or if you have a precisely more just procedural conception of recipe. So you can precisely wonder, when is it that a recipe comes into existence? And I think a key question there is whether you need what I call the fiat of a certain agent that calls the recipe with a certain name, that names it, and so says, this is a pizza margherita, right? Or this is a bowl of pasta matriciana, and so in that case you have you do have you tie the identity of the recipe and in most importantly its existence to someone that names it. Or you could think that people can make a recipe even before naming it. And I think this is a really important question for legal purposes, and sometimes for the purposes of figuring out to what extent we can override what people say about the identity of a recipe. So, the person who comes up with a machine that makes pizza margherita, to what extent the person has the authority of claiming that is a pizza margherita, and you can think that the coming into existence of a certain way of making pizza margherita is tied just to a speech act of one person, that claims pizza margherita, but it depends upon a complex process of negotiation. Or you could even think that it depends on a process of precisely negotiation, evaluation that doesn't at all include the speech act. Okay, so to cut the longer story short about the coming into existence, for most recipes, we accept that someone invented pizza margherita when they gave the name to it. The story goes, for example, about pizza margherita, which is it's a very disputed story, but that there was a pizza maker in Naples that named the pizza after a visit, right, of the Queen Margherita to Naples, right? And so he did the pizza and said, this is pizza margherita, right? And so from then, the pizza margherita was invented. And you could think, was that really the moment when pizza margherita came into existence, or did it already exist before? It's just people didn't give it that name. And to what extent the identity of pizza margherita depends depends on that act, and in what ways the reference, of what is pizza margherita depends on the act. This is a really important question for the identity of recipes. I think we have lots of examples that suggest that the identity doesn't strictly depend on this moment, of baptism, but it's also true that this moment seems to be crucial in many cases to tell apart different recipes. And so that's, what makes a recipe come into existence. I wonder, when is it that a recipe goes extinct? So you could argue that if one day we will not have any more cocoa plants, be able anymore to make chocolate ice cream, I don't know, or chocolate bars. Is that the case? Maybe we could make bars that really taste like chocolate bars, but they don't have any cocoa powder in them, or they have zero, cocoa, but they have all the smell of cocoa. So there were two artists some years ago in Philadelphia, New York, that made a little food truck called the Ghost food truck that precisely recreated the experience of tasting things like chocolate without there being any chocolate there, just by smelling it. And so you could think that maybe you could have a chocolate bar just by smelling it, or by eating something that has the smell of chocolate bar, and we could call that in the future chocolate bar, without there being any cocoa content in them. And so you could think at that point, maybe the recipe will still be even in existence, meaning that it's still there, and even though we don't have any more of the ingredients. So this question about what when is it that a recipe goes out of existence is a question that is especially important when we think about cultural heritage, or when we think about the possibility of tasting things that existed in the past. And we want to assess to what extent we can really taste things from the past when we don't have any more of the ingredients, or to what extent we could preserve certain recipes even when we lose certain ingredients. Because as we know, maybe most ingredients that we're using today, in a few decades, they will not any longer be available, and so how are we going to think about the identity of food as we move forward, along the decades, and think about what kind of names we can use for recipes? I hope this clarifies a little bit the issues.
No, by a lot actually, and like just sort of playing devil's advocate. Like, what about sort of a skeptical position about all of this that says no, it's just too fluid. Like, there's too many things going on, and we cannot do it. And maybe we start hiding behind this idea of authority, and then the question is, who has the authority? And you can have a skeptical response to that. Like, so what about the skeptical route? Like, how do you respond?
No, it's a great. I think it's a. Can we devise principled ways of agreeing about these topics without making consumers totally skeptical? And on the other hand, you can also wonder if we try to come up with principles, are we in a way trying to regiment food cultures and cultures? You think that any form of regimenting culture is in itself problematic, because every time we try to enclose cultural practices, in the end, we risk of ruining the beauty of the creativity of culture, all the energy that comes out of that. So I think what is really important is to start drawing some distinctions also between contexts. First of all, between types of recipes. So one of the things that I really started seeing in recent years is that it's very important to distinguish between types of recipes, like what you could call, the recipes of, I don't want to say only tradition or grandma, but sometimes it could be more extemporaneous recipes, like precisely a pizza margherita or an amatriciana or, a falafel, something that really belongs to a widespread culture.
Yes.
These recipes, they should definitely be left much more free than others. But there are other types of recipes that get much closer to medicines, where the negotiation is different. So think of higher taxonomic categories of recipes, such as yogurt or bread. What is it that counts as bread, as a yogurt, as olive oil, or some of these products, are we have procedures for making them. We have list of ingredients, and they're highly regulated, by authorities, state authorities, or in some cases, interstate authorities and international authorities. And so what we want to have for those, I think for those categories, we do need theories of recipes, because there are legal issues at stake there, and they get disseminated in a lot of contexts where the only mean of communication between the producer and the consumer is the label, or is any other information that could be represented like through a QR code. So in those cases, we have to have some principles that establish how those labels are used, because precisely countries and in general authorities do come up with rules and regulations for production. So we have to have a theory, for those instances. And we have to have a theory, I think, for clarifying under which conditions or circumstances it makes sense to promote a certain form of culture, right? And when is it that you have a cultural appropriation, for example? So just to mention something, if you have a company that makes tacos and calls them tacos and is a fast food chain, under which conditions they are entitled to call them tacos, and under which conditions are they doing culture, are they really engaging in some form of cultural appropriation, and who's going to determine that? Or recently there were cases in dining halls, even in school cafeterias, in colleges, universities, where the students accused the college of misrepresenting a certain culture. And in order to do that, I think the interests of these students are very important to recognize. But in order to do that, you have to have a theory of the cultural item that you're talking about. There were cases also on TV, because a lot of food now has become such an important soft power also on TV. Yeah. And there are some minority groups that are protesting about the ways in which their food is represented on TV, the way in which is described, portrayed, how it is associated to practices or not. And in order to claim that a certain TV program is misrepresenting a culture, you have to have a theory of the item. Otherwise, how else are you going to define it, or to understand what is an issue? And so in those circumstances, we do need a theory. I think when it comes to home cooking, I don't think we want to enter into those spheres. Or perhaps even restaurant cooking, we don't want to enter into that sphere. So we have to, I think, do a careful analysis of where is it that we want to get more specific, or we need to get more specific about recipes. If it's about public health, if it's about legal issues on food production, food trade, and where is it that instead we should really let people, play their own games and decide for themselves what they wanna use, and let the conversation flow.
That's interesting. So there we might have like a distinction between like the private sphere and the public sphere, and then now bringing in the notion. So we talked about authority, but one notion you sort of emphasize within that space of authority is authoriality, if I pronounce it correctly. So like when now thinking about these different spheres, right, where you say, okay, maybe in a restaurant, like there shouldn't be sort of any authority telling them, what they should be doing. Like, how does this notion help us navigate through some of these questions?
Yeah, the authoriality, the idea of the authoriality is who can claim to be the author of a certain recipe. And this is an interesting question. So for any type of recipe, you can think of who can author it. And there are some recipes, for example, so-called signature recipes, where you can think that the author probably can be only one person, or one team of cooks. They are really those that author their recipe every night in a certain restaurant or in a specific context. There might be recipes that are even just like your own. Maybe you have your own, recipe that you like to make, and you think that it's like your own recipe. Like you are the only one who can make it in a sense the way you want it. And it's almost like the grandma's way of making a certain food that many people have, or it could be the mother, the grandma, the grandfather, the father, whoever, the person that you're attached to, that you think the way they make it is really there. It creates a very specific kind of entity. So authoriality can come in such specific forms, but there are precisely what are called open recipes, such as a pizza margherita or maybe a falafel, where you think anyone can make it, in a very nice recent series for Food for Kids, I won't tell the name, but it's they cook gazpacho, and a very beautiful thing that the chef they introduces, he says, is gazpacho belongs to the entire humanity. Everyone can make it. Yeah, it originated from Spain. I like to make it because in a way I grew up making it. I'm from Spain, but really belongs to the humanity. So it's an open recipe. Anyone can make gazpacho and enjoying it and find enjoyment in that. So these open recipes, the authoriality is open. Anyone can take their recipe and make it their own. There are other recipes. There are recipes in a technical sense of the term, such as geographical indications. So think of Parmigiano Reggiano, I don't know, or Champagne wine, where instead the production is tied to a consortium. So you have the authority of a consortium, where the consortium establishes certain rules for the recipe, and so the authoriality there is given only to some people, if they follow certain rules. So it's a different structure of authoriality. So I like to think that for recipes, you have different structures of authoriality depending on precisely who's there making them, and this can help us clarify under which terms we can negotiate their own identities. I think to negotiate the identity of gazpacho is very different than negotiating the identity of yogurt or champagne. Champagne, you have to go to the consortium or to think of how the consortium structure works. We can challenge the structure. Perhaps we should. I think I've argued that too, but it's a certain type of argument. Instead, if you want to challenge the identity of gazpacho, it's a completely different issue, because the authoriality structure of gazpacho is different than champagne. And we should understand, to think of that, to see that, means to understand that the type of concept, the concept is declined in different ways, precisely because its authoriality depends on very different forms. Okay, so there isn't just whether you have a realist conception recipes or constructivist, existential, and so on, but it's also what kind of forms of authoriality are involved when we are discussing a specific recipe. So for that recipe, what is the authoriality that is attached to? And typically when we introduce a recipe, we also clarify its own structure of authoriality. Pizza Margherita is an open recipe, and that's what the company that wants to, to make the process of production, to mechanize the process of production, they really, latch onto that. They exploit the fact that it's open. Anyone can make it their own way, and there is really no form of, there is no way of fixing their identity in a much more precise way. And the best way of negotiating it then would be protesting or for people to refuse eating it. But if people like to eat it, then it will get accepted, and perhaps that's how it should be. It's an open recipe. That's what one could argue.
And if we think a little bit more about like sort of this consortium case, like in some sense, like could you sort of have like a political interpretation of it, I guess, where we attach we have to attach the authority to some in some way. So it could be a group of people or a group of companies, or it could be the state, right? But so if we don't think about like the ideal state, but not talking about sort of, you know, an actual state, but the ideal sort of state of affairs for regulating, being the authority for recipes, like what sort of political ways of organizing are, like, would you be thinking about that, you know, might they already exist or should be existing?
No, that's a great question. And there are examples. I think the models that many people are developing these days are in different parts of the world. They're from Asia, you know, or parts of Africa, South America, and Europe too. They're what are called participatory models. So think very, you know, to get a very basic case, famous case is the one of champagne, right? So champagne is one of the oldest products to be protected by denomination of origin, and right now the production of champagne is regulated by producers, only producers, that then decide those things in consultation with maybe local and national political authorities and some experts if they want to consult them, of course, wine experts, traders, exporters. But rarely in those processes, citizens and consumers are involved. Okay, it's not participatory. And for example, champagne production right now is facing some important challenges because with climate change, you have to rethink about the whole production process, including where to produce it, if to go higher up and you know, on the hills, mountains, what kind of grapes to use. Maybe you should allow genetically modified grapes, or whether to change completely the area of production. Maybe people even fancy that we should start making champagne in Norway in the future, or certainly in England, you know, like in Kent. And who should decide of these, you know, these issues, where to go to produce and how to change the production line of champagne? So many people, I think, today argue that there should be a more participatory process. They should involve consumers and people whose identity is, you know, is related to champagne, whether they consume it or not. The people who live in the Champagne region, their identity is tied, you can think, to the product. And so maybe they should become part of the conversation, even though maybe they are not, they don't own the companies, or they're not, you know, directly part of it. So this is participatory models of this sort have been developed, not only with respect to food products, but I think one really interesting model for the future is to think of participatory models like this for all sorts of products. You know, there could be denominations of origin like champagne, but you could even have something like, as I said, pizza margherita. Maybe it becomes controversial. I'm not talking about just the Napolitan pizza margherita, for which there is a consortium, you know, of Napolitan, but just pizza margherita in general. You could have a consortium of producers and you know, important stakeholders that actually poll people and figure out a strategy to understand how to move forward in naming the recipe, you know, as you go ahead. Honestly, a lot of companies already do this. I remember some years ago, there was a Portuguese beer, again, I won't mention it now, that was trying to think of what kind of name they should have used for their beer, if it should have been traditional, if it should have been authentic, if it should have been local, and they polled consumers. You know, the companies do use participatory strategies all the time. They poll consumers and they ask, would you call this more authentic or traditional? And then they see what consumers reply, and then of course then they decide what to do. And perhaps we should do this also with a number of food items, you know, so to share the authoriality in a more complex way.
I see. Okay, that's interesting. Although the question always will be, right, like who is participating, right? Like who are these consumers that we're taking to be the relevant consumers?
And I think this is where philosophers and people who, it's very important because many of these processes involve businesses and involve political, you know, parties, and involve also, I think, academics and scholars who work in public institutions or who don't have a vested interest, direct interest into this, are a very good place where to start figuring out strategies that seem to be more fair, you know, and precisely because you can have philosophers political philosophers, sociologists, anthropologists, but also people working in economic, different economic systems, legal scholars that should, put together their forces in trying to come up with better ideas of how to name, these foods. They are more systematic and they are more fair, so in a way that we precisely have a scientific, what you could call a scientific approach to the scientific, which doesn't mean, of course, natural science. It just means that it's done with the purposes of using the best knowledge that we have available today to, to come up with criteria for managing these very complicated concepts. Pizza margherita seems something really innocuous at first, but it's a very complex notion that has a lot of ramifications, and we have to have a good theory of that. And unless we do that, we will not be able to allow consumers, I think, to navigate food systems in a way that is fair. Because in the end, you're just leaving the door open for companies to make exploitations or for to have local agreements that are unfair to some consumers or to they are partisan, to parts of society. So what we want to avoid is that as much as possible. Then, of course, it's really difficult to think of a perfect model. I think that is the goal of scientific research.
Yeah. And maybe one last question that comes to mind is, when we think about recipes and then those consortiums that might sort of specify, right, these are the necessary conditions or parts, that need to be part of the recipe. That would be maybe one level of sort of describing what a recipe would be about. But what about sort of then the experience, like sort of the experiential part of then, for example, in the case of champagne, drinking the champagne, like, if you talk about sort of normativity in the context of, who should have the authority there, like instead of looking at sort of the necessary ingredients, it would be actually delivering the necessary experience, which people ultimately sort of resonate with, although that might be a little bit more vague. Seems to be the case, but it seems to be more how we potentially categorize in the end. Oh yeah, this gave me that type of experience, which I would put in the category of champagne or something like that. Like, does that make sense?
Of course, that's such a nice example. So think of this. Oftentimes you can go to a friend's home and they'll tell you, would you like some champagne? It happens a lot, even in the US context for sure, but in a lot of other places, people will ask, do you want some champagne even on a, on a plane, in a cafe at someone's home? And then they give you something, and if you look at the bottle, it's not labeled champagne, right? Because it's not what, they didn't mean, do you want something that is legally called champagne? They meant, do you want something that recreates the experience of having some champagne? Yeah. And they didn't care about the legal terminology in those cases, right? Yeah. And it's very similar to, you go to a restaurant, they ask you, do you want some Parmesan on that? And they give you some Parmesan. It's not whether it's Parmigiano or some other product that taste is very similar to that, but it doesn't have the name because for legal reasons, they cannot use it, right? So all those instances, they occur, on a daily basis. There are instances where we are not using precisely, I think, the legally constructed notion of the recipe of the term, but we are actually using the naive conception, or in some cases it could be the existential, what say we have been used to call it, But in many cases it could be the naive conception. So it could be, do you want something that naively we call champagne? Yeah, sure. Then, of course, legally, we wouldn't call it champagne. If you want to be precise, this is not champagne. It's actually a sparkling wine produced in, with the so-called classic method, maybe in southern Spain. But it doesn't matter if it's from Catalonia, from California. You can call it champagne from a naive perspective, and it seems perfectly all right. I wouldn't question that. It seems out of place.
No, that case is certainly helpful, but I'm actually also trying to emphasize sort of setting a higher bar where you say, okay, even though you have all the ingredients that would make it champagne, maybe in sort of a way of listing the ingredients, it doesn't ultimately give the right experience. So where actually within sort of the category of champagnes that would already be more sophisticated and constructed, you're going to say, no, but here we have a normative dimension that recipes don't fully grasp sort of the experiential aspect. Therefore, there is this primacy of the experiential aspect. Therefore, the normative dimension should actually trump just listing the sort of necessary ingredients that we consider to be champagne.
So I think that is it's an excellent question. Perhaps I could answer in two parts. The first is that even consortia like champagne, they have an evaluative moment like that. Oh. So each year, if you are a champagne producer and you want to make champagne, it's not enough that you are conforming to the rules. But the very last rule is that you have to send samples of the bottle to the consortium. There is a tasting moment by experts, and they determine whether you pass the bar or not to be called champagne. And this is true of most, if not all, consortia. Then this moment for some consortia is more, this test for some consortia is more difficult than others to pass, and in some cases it's very easy, everyone passes, in some others not. And it happens for all the ones that I know and that I've studied, it does happen. But you could think there could be something even more than that, right? So there could be a bar that is even higher, where to really deserve the name champagne, you have to be even higher up on some rankings. And I think that happens too among circles of experts, where they precisely think that champagne, again, could be an example. Champagne, there are very basic producers that make champagne that is considered for a broad market of non-experts, and then there is champagne for the expert market. And also there are some people that are more experts, they might think that they'll never drink the champagne that are produced for the masses, for non-expert consumers. And I don't know if this answers, in part to your question about raising the bar even more, so not lowering it on the other hand.
No, this certainly helps. And then maybe another question you raise is sort of the possibility of arranging recipes in taxonomies. And you think actually you sort of describe how both the hard sciences and the soft sciences could potentially help with that. So maybe we could discuss a little bit sort of the question of taxonomies, and then also why we should sort of care about these taxonomies.
Yeah. So taxonomies are it's a rather unexplored topics with respect to when it comes to philosophers. Maybe the people that have explored it the most are so-called formal ontologists. They're those in charge of coming up with softwares that represent a food world, and they have to figure out whether a pizza margherita is a pizza, right? So imagine that you're doing the software for the US Department of Agriculture, or for even better, the Food and Drug Administration in the US, and you have to figure out whether in a school lunch they're serving a pizza. And so you will have under your categories maybe pizza margherita or pizza napoletana, and then you have to see whether a pizza margherita has to be a pizza. Recipes, taxonomic layers from the most general one to the most specific ones. As we do organisms in a sense, or other forms of taxonomies. And you start from punk, and then you have punk rock, alternative punk, and so on and so forth, until you get to a specific song, or actually a specific version of a song, which would be, that song in a punk rock version, and so on and so forth. So with recipes, we could do the same, right? So I could ask you, would you like a cookie? And then you could think of, whether a cookie is a chocolate cookie, and then if it's a double chocolate cookie, and if it's, and so on and so forth, a double chocolate artisanal cookie. And so you can have taxonomic layers that go from the most general to the most specific, vice versa. And when we think about recipes, even in terms of procedures, we can think of what is the level of description of a procedure. So precisely, if I tell you how is it that you make bread, to take something really simple, or how it is that you make a cookie, you could give a procedure that's very general, like just take water, flour, yeast, some maybe salt, and then just, you know, follow a certain process, but very simple description. And then you leave open a lot of things, or you be much more specific, you know, with respect to the procedure. And so you can imagine that you can go from the more general to the more specific in different forms when it comes to recipes. And within each culinary system, you know, or culture that you want to, whatever term you want to use, you'd have different layers. So take something like precisely pizza. If you live, say, in the United States, there are some categories of pizza like New York style or Chicago style. They're really important. And because if you want a pizza margherita, then it makes a lot of a difference if it's New York style or Chicago style or, you know, Boston style. And these specifications don't exist, say, in Italy or in France or in Pakistan, no? So, but there you might have different specifications. Like in Italy, a very important difference is between wood oven or electric oven, you know, how it is cooked. And so this type of specifications, they give different taxonomic layers to a certain item. And now suppose that you have to, you know, to bring an item from one culinary system to another. So the problem that you might have is that you don't have a direct translation of that item into the other food system, and you have to figure out where to put it. So an example I give, for example, in the paper that you mentioned, is a recent paper about the 7 philosophical problems about recipes. Is it's about cookies and biscotti. You know, in the US and in other parts of the world that speak English, if we're just sticking to English-speaking countries, cookies and biscotti are typically kept separate. You know, so it's a biscuit. It's not a cookie. A cookie that there is a cookie could be a type of biscuit. Generally, that's but biscotti are then regarded as yet another type of biscuit. So you have biscuit and you have biscotti, you have cookies, you know, and biscotti and cookies have different shapes, they play different functions, and typically they're sold differently, they might have different markets too. Now, in Italy, cookies and biscotti, there is no such distinction, because actually in Italian, the term for cookies, what you use to translate cookies, is biscotti, biscotti. And so when you move from one to the other culinary system, they don't translate directly. You know, you have a taxonomic problem. That could, in some cases, be a commercial problem. You know, so because in some cases, some food items could be regarded as a dessert, but in another context, they might not be regarded as a dessert, or they might be regarded as items that are suitable for kids or not. They might be suitable for parties or not, or for cafes or not. And so when you do these translations, you enter into legal, commercial issues of public health, of cultural representations that can become quite sensitive. You know, so the example of cookie and biscotti is relevant up to some point, but then once you start moving into the territory, for example, of noodles, of whether certain items are regarded as desserts, you know, is cheese a dessert or not? And maybe whether it's a dessert or not, it has different legal statuses, it has different commercial, different tariffs. So those things become relevant, but also for dietary purposes. So if I tell you, you know, and then you can have a dessert, is cheese included or not? And sometimes these dietary guidelines, if we are not precise, we risk of running into troubles with communicating, you know, a certain policy. And so this is especially important when you think of even how foods, you know, communication about food proceeds across different cultures too.
Yeah.
So you have a doctor that speaks to a patient that at home uses a culinary system that is quite different from a dominant culinary system within a certain country.
Yeah.
And the doctor naively says, and then you should avoid desserts, but what is a dessert for that person is very different to what is from the doctor. Or the doctor says, oh, you should avoid pasta because he's used to think of pasta cooked in a certain way or used in a certain way and not. And so you really have miscommunication.
Yes.
Where instead the presumption typically is that there is no ambiguity between those food items, but actually oftentimes there is, and we just never thought about it because there is really very little work on this topic. It's something that has, as far as I know, has never been thoroughly researched by people working on food, on the conceptual aspects of food. And I think it has instead a lot of relevance in quite different contexts, from legal, economic to public health to translation of cultures from one menu to another, and where you want to avoid cultural misrepresentation or even appropriation in some cases. So how do we translate that?
No, I think it's very helpful, and it sort of functions then as a map, like how to navigate, right? When you have sort of the entire landscape, or at least that's how I'm sort of imagining it. In the previous episode, actually, with Professor Valdenti, also when we talked about recipes, he emphasized a lot, right? How recipes sort of convey information. And you actually also have one article that was one of my favorite articles, actually, which just talks about the architecture of the dish. So you introduce sort of this idea as the architecture of the dish. So maybe you could sort of help us understand what is this notion of the architecture of the dish, and how is this going to help us understand how recipes actually deliver us specific type of information.
Okay, so that piece on the architecture of a dish deals with this type of settings where you have a cook and you have a diner, and the cook communicates something to the diner non-verbally, right? And there are many different ways of doing that. In some cases, you can use taste. You can use maybe just some symbols, in a food, whatever it is that you use, but something that has a symbolic value within a certain culture. But in that piece, we focused on how the cook can communicate to the diner how to consume a food by signaling it through the presentation of the actual dish in the sense of the concrete, plate or whatever it is used for serving the food, right? It could also be a street food, like a cone. If I give you a cone, I give it to you in the hand, it becomes pretty evident from the cone and the structure and the way I hold it, how you may approach it, and consume it. And so we were wondering to what extent some foods are very legible in terms of consumption from the way they look, how the fact that they should be like a cone, of course, they should be handled, taken by hands and consumed right then. But then a cone, maybe it leaves you open with respect to, where to lick it, how to proceed in consuming it, especially, from which side. But there are some foods instead that really invite you to start from a specific side because of their shape and to proceed like that, right? And so that was the type of exercise, the type of study to see to what extent some foods and really then recipe procedures for preparing those foods help the cook to communicate to the diner how to consume the food. And it's also there is really important to think that is, it's a game. So sometimes a cook can purposefully decide to leave it completely open to the diner where to approach, a certain dish, and just leave it as a game, how to proceed. But there are instead other instances where it becomes very important to see how to proceed. And it's very, I think, the most successful recipes are the ones where the cook non-verbally can manage to establish whatever game the cook wanted to establish with the diner, right?
Yep.
Without having to say anything. I don't have to come to the table and tell you, look, you're supposed to take this by your hand and dip it into the sauce and eat it, but you just see it right then, what you're supposed to do. And maybe it's completely open, and that's what the cook wants to do, and so to engage in playfulness. But it's, the most successful or interesting dishes are the ones where it's pretty obvious what kind of game it is that you're playing. And I think it's something that has been neglected in the literature on perception and action when it comes to consumption. And there is, if you can think an area where is particularly interesting, could be, say, with kids, but it could be also in all sorts of occasions where the verbal communication fails for some reason or other. And so in those cases, to be able to master that type of communication can become really crucial, right? So with the kid, visually you communicate even if the kid doesn't understand you, but the kid can knows what to do.
And when you sort of elaborate on this idea of the architecture of the dish, right, you also actually invoke literature in the philosophy of mind and cognitive science and embodied cognition. So one being sort of practical knowledge, right, and the other one being affordances that I think also a lot of people in AI have been talking about. So how do both of those notions come into play when we talk about the architecture of the dish, sort of with some technical terminology in there?
Yeah, because we use the idea that the food, the dish as is prepared has certain affordances, which means that it communicates to the diner, or has the possibility of communicating to the diner, the diner that grabs, that sees those affordances, how to proceed, right, in consuming. And that however, this notion of affordance has to be tied to a certain understanding of practical knowledge. So if we know that by seeing the cone, a diner will immediately grab it in a certain way because the cone affords to the diner a certain action. All of these activity happens at a level that is clearly non-verbal, and that is also in many cases non-conscious, in the sense that the diner will just immediately see that and do it based on precisely past experiences and training with respect to eating, cooking in a certain way, right? So if you have been trained to eat with chopsticks, immediately when you look at the food, you will see some affordances that someone that is not used to eat with chopsticks will not see, because maybe it could be, say, a sushi maker, someone that made you some noodles, some jajangmyeon. We use some examples of, say, Korean foods in some papers. Can use its own past experiences with handling chopsticks in understanding how the diner is supposed to grab it. But if you have never used chopsticks, maybe you will not see it. Maybe you can even think that the chopstick is just a tool to penetrate a certain food item, right? And so you will miss the understanding of you will not see certain affordances. In the same way that for someone that is not used to eat with a fork, will be really difficult to see the affordance in a certain bite of food that suggests, eat me with the fork, so stab me, because it's not used to think of food as something that can be stabbed. The idea of stabbing, for example, of a food that is, as you know, probably relatively recent in the history of dining, is really a measured distinction, for example, in food affordances around the globe. So yeah, we put together those literature. And what is, I think that there is some research. Jeremy Lafrère is an especially interesting researcher, I think, working at the Bocuse Institute. They have have been studying how, to what extent kids, even already from very early years, they see those things. So kids from the age, early ages, before even they can speak, they recognize these distinctions. And it's particularly interesting for thinking how we can, suggest a certain food education even before we can have verbal education, we can have verbal responses, but we can communicate precisely by tweaking the affordances within a food and triggering certain responses in kids.
Mm-hmm. And one question that comes to mind, which might be a bit of a stupid question, is sort of when we think about sort of the architecture of a dish, right, and then the diner recognizing certain affordances, but what about sort of a diner that doesn't recognize it? Like, would it be correct to say that like they would be potentially eating a different dish because they just eat it in such a different way, right? Like where instead of eating the cone, they just start eating it, completely opposite side, like. Would that be plausible?
No, that's great. If you see that, then you see the reasons for having a procedural conception of a recipe versus a culinary conception of a recipe, right? So the procedural conception tells you that, if you follow the right procedure and you put it on a plate or whatever it is that you use to convey it, then, you are eating that food. And instead, the culinary conception tells you, no. If you're offered, say, I don't know, sushi, and you stab it with your chopstick, you're not eating sushi, you're destroying it before eating it. And so it's not sushi anymore. Whatever it is, you're putting something into your mouth that used to be sushi, and then now is just some kind of edible concoction that doesn't have a name, shouldn't have a name. So that's and that is because the culinary conception of the recipe thinks that the recipe is really given also by the context within which you eat it. And an important part of that is precisely that certain procedures are properly communicated and then executed.
And one problem that you sort of raise in this context is what you call the interface problem of recipes, and you say that sort of mirrors a similar sort of interface problem in the philosophy of mind. So what sort of problem are we dealing with there?
Yes, whether you do have this link between the cook and the diner. How can we have this establish this connection? So the interface between the ideas, the thoughts of the cook that is thinking of how to suggest to the diner something, and uses certain certain cues in the form of affordances to suggest certain actions to the diner. So you are interfacing the ideas of a cook with the practical action of a diner, and so it's you're trying to establish a communication that is not happening at the same level. It's between precisely the intention of a cook and the agency, the action that, as we said, is not entirely intentional, of a diner.
Helpful. And maybe shifting topics a little bit, as you mentioned in the beginning, sort of talking about, right, clarifying, certain concepts, right? One of, the sort of the project that you've also embarked on is specifically focusing on the sort of the concept of local food, which has become very much mainstream, but you think there's still a lot of ambiguity and sort of confusion about what it really means to be local food. So maybe you could just introduce how should we philosophically be thinking about this topic of local food?
Yeah, local food is it's a subject of research that has already been studied by a number also of philosophers, including maybe Ian Wertheiser, that with Samantha Knoll, they wrote some important pages on this topic, and a number of other philosophers, like Matthew Adams, for example. But the way in which I studied this topic with two colleagues of mine, younger colleagues, Nicola Piras and Beatrice Serini, it looks at the complexity of the concept of locality in a way that probably hadn't been done before, in this sense that when we speak about something being local, about a food item, for example, being local, about food item being local, you can consider quite different levels of food items.
Mm-hmm.
So, for instance, you can consider an ingredient as local,
Yep.
and even that ingredient as local, you might mean that it's the evolutionary history that is local,
Mm-hmm.
or that it's the producer, like the farm where it was produced, that is local, right? Or that it's a certain way of growing it that is local.
Mm-hmm.
That's just the ingredient. Then you could have the recipe, the entire recipe. So you could have that a certain way of making chocolate in Switzerland or in Sicily are local to Switzerland or Sicily. So the recipe is local, but clearly the cocoa beans are not, right? Nor is the sugar, or maybe even the milk, or some of the other ingredients that you use.
Yeah.
So the recipe could be local. Sometimes what is local could be the meal. So having a certain structure of meal.
Mm-hmm.
So think of having a structure of meal where you have the entree, the main course, and the dessert, which is a typical French structure that became somewhat international at some point. So this structure can be local precisely to Paris, or to some places more local than others. Or think of the time. So to have dinner at 6 p.m. could be local to Portland and to maybe Helsinki, but not to Cagliari in Sardinia, or to Rome, or to Alcalá in Spain. So locality can be said of a lot of different aspects of the food world, different food items. And so then you can put these together with different conceptions of locality that have been put out on the on the conversation, the debate, like the distance, the geographical distance. How many kilometers did the food travel before it ended up on your plate, or whether a certain food is typical. So you could think that champagne is local to Champagne region, so typicality in that sense. Or local by intending that there is very little distance between the producer and the consumer. Like the consumer, you know the producer, you have talked to them, you know a lot about their farm. They might be 5,000 miles from you of distance, but they are local to you because you know them. That is also that conception of locality. So the so-called social distance. So you have geographical distance, typicality, social distance. They're quite different notions, and each of them can be used to refer to the ingredient or to the recipe or to different layers, right? So what we studied is how we can use a certain this type of conceptual analysis, conceptual insight into locality, in order to account for the fact that we need conceptions of locality that are more complex or articulated. So they're what we call sometimes single versus multiply located, multi-place conceptions of locality. So for instance, take a person that lives in Eindhoven, so if you're in Eindhoven, but that grew up in Seoul, Korea, so in South Korea, right? So you grew up in Korea, but you've been living in Eindhoven for the past 20 years, and you have a multi-conception of locality. Maybe you eat, you want to eat, I don't know, kimchi, because that's for you, but you buy local cabbage and you make it, you eat it in a meal that has a structure that is more Dutch. So you have a Dutch structure of a meal, but you have a food item, a recipe that is Korean, but there is that you consider maybe attached to that place because you use the ingredients that you sourced in that place. Right? And so you could think that that's local kimchi, and you eat in a fashion that follows some local usages. And you could wonder to what extent there is a local food, and in what ways you can realize a certain idea of eating local in Eindhoven if you are a Korean immigrant that want to also continue its own certain aspects of a certain culinary tradition, that you make your own. And so then, if you think about it, lots of people, probably most people worldwide, they have a certain conception of locality that of this form, where locality is a negotiation between different types of identities that involve how you source your food, how what kind of schedule you follow, what kind of meal structures, what kind of settings, what kind of recipes, and so on and so forth. And this applies not just to home cooking, but maybe also to restaurants. So what are the restaurants that are local to Eindhoven? What does it mean to be local to Eindhoven? Can a Vietnamese restaurant be local to Eindhoven? And I think, of course, it can. And we have to figure out under which conditions you establish that as being local. When is it that? And it's clear in many conversations we're having today about food and identity that the notion we need of locality is much more complex than just something that is geographically produced nearby us, or where we don't have social distance. We need something that is that can accommodate precisely an existential understanding of locality, so to speak, right? That where people can construct local identities, and even a restaurant can have space to construct a local identity based on some forms of negotiation or reconstruction of this idea that, of course, it has to be, so to speak, narrated. I don't want to say justified, but narrated, to others. But we have to make space for these conceptions. And if you look at a lot of conversations we have about local food, even though they start with the idea of being inclusive or being alternative ways of consuming food outside of a certain food system, so they're really social protest movement to some extent, but they end up becoming movements that cut out some people from possibly eating local. Right? If we have a conception of locality where locality means that you can't make kimchi in Eindhoven and consider it local, then I think you have a problem, because you will have that an important sector of the population, I don't want to say about kimchi, but it might be about some other social groups, they are not allowed to call something local, even though you could argue that it is, because maybe they have been cooking it for decades in Eindhoven, and that's the place where they belong, where they think they belong. You have to ask them. And so really locality there, it gets entangled, linked with these debates about belonging, about place and identity. And I think what we wanted to do in that paper especially is to open up a bit more the analysis at different ontological levels of locality. So from ingredients precisely to meals, diets, and different, of course, conceptions of locality, and to situate that within a debate precisely of food and culture, intended as belonging, location.
No, that's very helpful. And in some sense, the door is still open to sort of further distinguish than when you talk about sort of the social conception of locality, right? We might be saying the social identity conception of locality and the social ethical conception of locality. Like there's still further distinction to be made that still might interact with some of the spatial sort of definition, but there's further room for distinctions, I suppose, right? And then the question is, which one we care about. But the point is also, in some sense, how can we make it inclusive? Because there are so many different dimensions within sort of the ontology of food that we should consider.
Yes. No, it's exactly that, and so you could have these different ramifications, and in a way you can think of local as tied, so the idea of place, so construction of place and place making, having a place for ourselves is it's a very complex notion, right? Where you could have a certain conception of locality at home and a different conception of locality in a restaurant, for example, or with colleagues at work. And I think this is entirely in keeping with our agency when it comes to consuming foods. So that we have different precisely notion identities. We take on also different identities depending on social settings. And we should have a notion of locality that leaves room for that flexibility, especially where you have very important ethical and political reasons, cultural reasons for having that. There are people for whom that's the only way in which they can find a place for their own food culture, you know, by constructing a certain idea of locality also at home. And I think it's really important to leave room for that.
And ultimately for me, like when we talk about, for example, like sort of a local food movement, right? In the end, you know, when people say, or I think you mentioned, right, like it being sort of a social protest as well, right? Like then ultimately the question does sort of become, okay, how do we specify as a movement which values we embody in our notion of locality, right? Where we are trying to put certain principles forward there. When we have many different dimensions of locality, I guess the question of which values attach to these different notions also becomes more complex, which then as a whole sort of social movement, which might already be putting a lot of people together under sort of that label, becomes an even more tricky question about like, okay, how do we then specify which values we can all at least agree on? Do you think we can make progress there?
Yeah, it's a really delicate part of the paper and of the you know of the issue here. How do we negotiate these identities in a fair way, right? Because again, here we might be dealing with locality at different levels, right? So you could have a company making a product and call it a local product. And so there you have commercial purposes that are involved. And you could think of what is a fair negotiation of locality at that level, and under which conditions the usage of the term locality is fair. And I think what we argue there in the paper, for example, is that the concept of locality has to be fallible, meaning there has to be something that could turn out to be non-local under that conception. You know, where you may be wrong to claim that it's local, but it might not be, so it cannot be. But also that it has to be open for so we will be thinking about different notions of locality. I think something else that maybe wasn't included in that paper yet is that there are touches to what we were talking about before, is that there are probably spheres that are more private of locality where we don't want to hold anyone responsible for negotiating those identities of locality with anyone. It's like your own sense of locality, and you know, it's like the right to self-determination in a sense. But that's very different from when you have a restaurant calling themselves you know, those that make the best local food, or having a company advertising something as local. At that point, there are commercial purposes involved, and there are aspects where cultural items become also precisely commercially exploited, and could become even legally contentious or politically contentious. So for those cases, we certainly need some principles for negotiation. For what is fairness. And there we have to look at, I think political philosophers have done quite a bit there for us in the sphere.
No, certainly, yeah, I think that could certainly help. And then thinking about sort of the future of our food diets, right? So you have a paper where you talk about different food utopias, and you sort of set out two distinct approaches. One that focuses sort of on the anthropological approach, and then which has the technological approach. And you have some worries for both of these approaches that you think we should be aware of. So maybe you could just introduce both of these approaches, how they think about, you know, the issues related to sort of human diets for the future, and then, you know, both worries for those of approaches.
Yeah, in general, I hope it emerges a little bit from this conversation what I was talking about at the beginning, meaning an approach based on working on concepts like locality or like recipe, and trying to think how revising them, adjusting them, or having a better theoretical grasp of these concepts can help us navigate and have suggestions for a number of conversations we're having about food. And certainly most of those conversations concern the future of food, meaning how we move forward in advancing policies about food, making food laws, or rethinking, even in a creative way in a restaurant, about foods. So when we think in general, this is about how we think about the future of food. And when we approach the future of food, Warren Velasco famously made this distinction between ways of adjusting it, fixing it, that are rooted into changing our own attitude towards the food, the way, basically, how we consume it, the consumption.
Yeah.
And then approaches that instead look at fixing how we produce food, right? So the idea is right now we are consuming too much meat, and this is a problem for the planet. What can we do? Yeah. So a technological fix would be thinking, okay, let's just produce meat differently. I'll produce it in a lab. You can eat your same food. At least we will have it, we will call it by the same name. And if we will agree, find an agreement on that. And so you will have to change nothing. You will go to the supermarket, by the same thing, but the process for delivering that food will completely change, so that we have a fix that is really technological. It's about the technology of food production.
Yeah.
In the other case, instead the anthropological fix, the solution is you should stop eating meat and please start eating, I don't know, crickets, or so some type of insects that would be much better for the planet, or perhaps just be vegan or vegetarian, but much better. So in that case, the change you could think is only anthropological, meaning that is only, it's up to you. You can change that. You can go and buy only lettuce, spinach, and some other things and live with that very well, do a balanced diet, and you don't need to eat meat. So the fix could just be anthropological. So both of these changes, what people stress is the fact that when you try to change to fix the production process, at some point, in one way or another, that influences also the consumption, because once you know that the meat has been produced in a lab, you approach it differently. So what we realized is that the technological fix unavoidably affects also the anthropological attitude, and vice versa, right? So to change the anthropological attitude means that you will have to, if everybody will suddenly start eating kale, now we have to produce a lot more kale, and probably have to change the way in which we produce kale. So we need a technological fix too. So what people started looking at are so-called systemic fixes. So fixes that look at the entire system and how we can change the food system altogether. And because every change you make in a system will require also adjustments along the line. Right? So we have to change the food systems altogether. And there are some nice projects. For example, Tea Kortemaki leads a very interesting project on food, the transition of food justice, and so how we can transition towards better, more ethical food systems, and what kind of principles we have to use for that. It's a cooperation between different institutions in Finland, in Switzerland, and might be more, don't remember now all the details. And I think that's a very promising way of thinking. And what we suggested also in that paper and now in some other more recent work is the fact that really the role of philosophers in all of this is to introduce better concepts to rethink food systems. So to introduce concepts that can be used consistently across the food system, so that the communication between producers and consumers, among producers, and in general can function better. And so local food is a good example. So it's what is it that we are calling local, and how can we make it more clear, transparent to everyone involved in the process? Because really, when we talk about locality, some journalists, even you can find journal articles, magazine articles or newspaper articles that suggest that maybe we should almost abandon the concept of locality, because nobody knows anymore when you buy something local, what does it mean? And that's a problem. When you get to that, it means that you have a problem. You were trying to find a fix to the food systems. Locality was introduced precisely to describe an alternative food system that was a local food system. But now we don't know anymore what is a local food system. So we have to clarify that more, to see how locality can become or not a descriptor of food system, in what ways we are using it. It has to be much more, I think, clear. We hadn't thought through the complexity, I think, of place when we introduced the term. Not that we knew how it could have developed, but certainly now we saw that we have to do more work to have a proper treatment of the concept.
No, that's very helpful. And then like one thing sort of that comes to mind, I mean, because ultimately it also comes down to how do we then communicate it, right? So local food, I mean, we have to acknowledge sort of its complexity, right? But then usually I guess the question also becomes, and when do we potentially reduce it again to more simplistic terms, right? Like this sort of going back and forth between, okay, there is this complexity, but also there's this need sometimes to package it as such that it can be digested more quickly, right? That might be the challenge.
Yeah, for sure. And that's precisely where you might think you could be a conceptual engineer. When you do that, it might be really the engineering moment. I think before is much more philosophical, like you're really exploring different notions, creating models. But then the engineering moment is when someone comes to you and says, look, we need a good conception of locality for restaurants in Eindhoven, or for delivering food policies in Eindhoven. And at that moment, you have to put together a concept that is that works there. And you need to understand what are the variables at play. And that's precisely what your theory has to do. Your theory has to tell you what are the different aspects that are crucial for assessing those circumstances. And of course, it's not that philosophers can do this on their own. They have to work with people that supply data, with the sociologists, with anthropologists, with all sorts of, and clearly then with the municipality. But it's, I think philosophers can participate also in those moments. There are ways in which we can do this at a higher level. For example, if you're working with the food industry, maybe it can also be a worldwide, a global initiative. So you're not working for, a geographical region like Eindhoven, but it's more global. And then there are some enterprises that are very specific, even just to one restaurant, perhaps. Or
no, I think that's that's a great point. And then sort of one question that we've been discussing a lot on the podcast, or a lot, I mean, it came up a few times, is sort of can food be art? And in one of your articles, you specifically focus sort of on forms of public art. So that's something actually we didn't discuss so far. So maybe could you just introduce this idea, right? Like cooking and dining as forms of public art. Like how should we start thinking about that?
Yeah. So the idea we had in that paper was that there are a lot of occasions where food is crucial to our plays a crucial aesthetic function, and that this aesthetic function can seem, or has seemed to people in the literature, to be too low, so to speak, in order to be regarded as art. But they were still really significant, and because they played a really important public role in whatever is the conception of the public. And so in the same way that you could argue, say, that graffiti, or it could be dance, dance within communities like tango was in Argentina, right? Or you could think of some form of singing, like it was blues in the fields, when workers, they were forced to labor, and they were singing to enhance their condition, elevate their condition. There are a number of ways in which food can play very similar functions, where food can elevate our condition, or food can be used to enact a social protest, like a graffiti, or can be used to memorialize, so keeping the memories, something that is really important that happened, like sometimes we do even with songs, to keep the memory of slavery, or to keep a memory of something that was really beautiful, maybe in the past or in the present. And so we thought that we had to draw a connection between precisely what in this case has been Walter Stoff. It's a really important author, with seeing art also in places that are more mundane or everyday, right? And so precisely, you know, in a field, and with people singing in a field, and so we thought that we should see a lot of occasions of dining as occasions where food became something that had really a public value. And so in the paper, we discuss instances of precisely where food is a form of memorializing, like, you know, keeping the memory of the escape from Egypt, say, for the Jewish, right? Or some important religious moments. But even it could be a birthday or a wedding or some other occasion that could be more personal, you know, between us, something that we establish. It's food as a way of memorializing. Or food could be a way of protesting, enacting a protest, a performance that is a protest, from a hunger strike to a hunger banquet that enacts, you know, something that people should understand about conditions, you know, the living conditions of people around the world, and to maybe the rights of women, you know, so hosting a banquet to affirm a certain condition of women, you know, around the world. And so about protesting, memorializing, and enhancing the human condition. So taking something that is a daily toil, the fact that you have to cook, say, pasta, and transforming it into something that is more aesthetically pleasing. And so we talked, for example, about this project, really interesting project called Pasta Grannies, where these grandmothers are seen as making pasta, but they're doing something that they really had to do, which was the daily toil of preparing some food from whatever it is that they had, but they used techniques for transforming it that made it nicer, right? So in the same way that you have to be in the field and talk or speak or remember something and you start singing it, so in the same way, these people that they had to prepare pasta, they started making it in a way that was elevating their condition and making it also aesthetically pleasing and creating a sense of community. And so food can do all of these things and have that value that we recognized as the public value that had an aesthetic significance and that we see as something that is public art. And so what we consider also are the venues where we should foster these, and there are a lot of different ways of doing that. Probably the most original idea we have in that paper is the one of creating a dedicated public venue for cooking. So like you have a theater for showing theater pieces, you have a music hall for music. Maybe we should have a dining hall that is a public dining hall where we should organize dinners that have a meaning, a specific meaning. It could be about killing animals. It could be about the beauty of plants, of mushrooms, or some history or whatever. But it could be basically, you could imagine having a pass to a season ticket where you go and you enjoy eating, or through eating you come to reflect on important items, right? On important themes. We're not far from doing that, and I don't think that all sorts of foods can be or should be discussed in this way through such a public venue, but it's certainly an interesting way of doing it.
No, certainly. No, I thought it was, very interesting. And I think also when I was talking to Charles Spence, he actually sort of emphasized in his book that there's more and more solo dining. So I guess this is really sort of a counter trend that should be started to make it more public. So no, I really like that. So maybe just as a final question, when we look at sort of, the future research directions with regards to the philosophy of food, everything that we've been discussing so far, what do you see as sort of the promising areas where philosophy could really contribute in sort of a cross-disciplinary way, but also maybe just philosophy of food contributing to other areas of philosophy? Just, I would be curious to know your thoughts.
Nice. I hope maybe has emerged from this conversation, and we haven't even talked, and we shouldn't, about consumption, like hunger, appetite. I have a whole line of research on that that is, I think, very important for the future. I hope that philosophers can work on food in collaborative efforts with other scholars for the future. And there are plenty of topics that haven't been explored yet, really plethora of topics that haven't been explored. So I just mentioned now hunger and appetite. They had been completely unexplored until a few years ago. There is still, we mentioned, I don't know, ingredients. There is still a lot to be done on that. And there are lots of other topics that philosophers should explore. And so I hope that while with respect to aesthetics and ethics, many questions have been addressed, but there are also yet more to be considered. Also, I think a number of theoretical angles of food will be explored in the future. This is my hope. For example, the epistemology of food. There are a lot of epistemological aspects that haven't been explored, and there is a lot about the epistemic justice that should be discussed. I've seen recently some talks, very promising talks about this, for instance, but I haven't yet seen, for example, any good papers, on that. I hope in the future someone will develop also that area. What is most important for me, I think, is that scholars, because this is a really emerging field, scholars working in this area, they dialogue with each other and they create conversations, and they have a conversation about methods, texts, and resources that we can put together. I think that's going to be really key for the field to develop in a promising way. I don't know if this successfully answers your question.
No, certainly, and I would be very interested in reading more also about sort of the philosophical work on hunger. So I think I will read it, and I will also make sure to put it in the description of the video so everyone can find it. But Professor Borghini, it was a pleasure. Thank you so much for being on the podcast. I really enjoyed this conversation. Do you have any parting words to the audience?
No, just I hope you get out and read more philosophy of food, because there is really a lot more even than what we have said today, of course, to explore. And there are books coming out on these books, articles every day. By now, it's really exciting to be working in this field. So I hope more and more also young scholars will join this, this enterprise.